The reason I think we grew faster than our competitors was relatively simple. At the foundation, we had owners competing with their employees, and so it wasn't a sales culture per se, it was a growth culture, which means everybody in the organization was responsible for growth. Everybody.
Hi, I'm Benj, founder CEO at Proton AI, the AI-powered CRM built specifically for distributors. And you're listening to In the Mind of a Distributor, where we interview the smartest minds in distribution. Let's get into it. Gary, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Really, really excited to have you. You've had an amazing run in the medical distribution space, and then you've actually escaped distribution to do things outside of the distribution world. But excited to have you on today to talk about sales, growth culture, technology, the whole thing. So Gary, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ben. It's a real pleasure to be here. Love the podcast I've seen you do before. So just excited to be here and, talk about some of the things we learned growing a business and, the screw-ups we made and the things we got right.
Awesome. Well, just starting out, we'd love to hear a little bit about how you got into distribution in the first place.
So I knew nothing about distribution. I ended up we were in the medical supply and equipment space. But the way I get in it was really just needing a job. I mean, it is as simple as that. So I was the middle child of 5 Irish Catholic family that was, not surprisingly, law enforcement. So my dad was, my mom actually was before that, aunts and uncles were, grandfather was, and I thought I was going to be that until, I was graduating, needed a job, and I met a founder of a company called PSS at the time at a business school. It was one of those days where they have, all the companies come in. And so there are all these super professional companies with these huge booths. And then there was this little booth with like a poster board and a couple of stars on the map because it was, starting.
How big was the company when they came to visit?
Probably about 15 million right at the time.
Yep.
So, and I'll tell you a story about how early on we were. But so I met founder says to me and some friends who were standing there, if you join our company, you have to be able to transfer anywhere we stay within 24 hours. So, of course, all my buddies walked away, but I grew up transferring around. Of course, he was exaggerated. But the point was, look, we're going to grow. We have a mission to grow. We're going to be the first national physician supply company. So we need people that are mobile and hungry, and then talk about joining early on. When I went to my first branch, which is Jackson, Mississippi, one of the things you had to do at the end of the day was go to supermarkets to find boxes to ship supplies the next day. So we pulled orders in shopping carts and then went to supermarkets to get boxes. And so I thought I would be smart. I went to a liquor store because I thought those boxes will be stronger. And then the next day shipped some gauze, I think, to a medical practice in a Jack Daniels box and learned that was not, a great idea. Not everybody's a whiskey fan, especially getting their medical supplies. But that's how early on we were. We were pure startup, Wild West.
Give a sense for what the market was at the time, because I think medical is interesting because today it's like extremely consolidated. There are a few very large players. I mean, PSS ended up being part of McKesson, which we'll get into. But what did the market look like where there was space for a new player that's $15 million in revenue to be able to grow? Like, were there a lot of small regional players? Like, what was the setup?
I don't think anybody ever thinks there's space for one more if you're already there. So if you probably ask the distributors that have been around for 100 years, because they were plenty around. Durfell is one, plenty been around a very long time. Really, it's really good family businesses, but highly fragmented. Tons and tons of, mom and pops, which sounds a little bit, dismissive, but lots of really good small businesses out there. And that's what we found. And they were serving small customers. Yeah. And the niche really that our founder and CEO found was that a lot of the physician offices that were small fragmented businesses, much like similar in the dental space, right before consolidation, was that they were being served by hospital supply companies, right, that also serve physicians. So a lot of the distributors were really built to serve larger, more sophisticated procurement type company, and then they serve physicians sort of as a secondary market. And so Pat Kelly, who was our founder, said there's room for someone to be the first national physician supply company, which says physician is our primary market. Everything we build will be for that small customer, that which is a physician office, and remember, a physician's really not trained in business, so there was a real opportunity to help them, with their businesses.
How long did it take to go from 15 million when you started up to 2 billion when you eventually sold the business to McKesson?
Yeah, great question. A little bit complicated answer, but I'll make it quick. So on the path from 15 million to 2 billion, we had a lot of screw ups, and luckily we got some foundational things right that enabled us to not die from our screw ups. But we actually went from about 15 million to about 2 billion, back to about 1.3 billion, and then back up to 2 billion. And so we got it. And so the answer to that is we got to about 1.3 billion. We bought into a diagnostic imaging business.
Yep.
Because we misdiagnosed our past success, which I find to see relatively often, sometimes in businesses. So we misdiagnosed why we were successful in physician, and then said, well, let's move into the imaging business there, because it's also got a lot of mom and pops that need rolling up. And so they need what we did in health, but we missed the one thing that most of what they sold was film. So the digital came along, and so we ended up having to sell the imaging business. It went from 2 billion back to 1.3 billion, and then grew it back up to 2 billion in our core business, which was physician and also extended care.
Was that like the only acquisition you guys did? So to get to the one, just before we get to that acquisition, get to the 1.3 billion, was that organic or inorganic or a combination?
It was a combination of both.
A combination of both.
So we were very much a believer in the organic approach, which was hire people like me right off the campus, train them within an inch of their lives, ship them to where the new territory is, and expand, open up a new office. I literally opened up a new office in El Paso, Texas, literally building shelving, go out, it's very Wild West. But at the same time, is if we found good companies, good mom and pops, that would be a good partner of PSS. So we did many, many, many acquisitions, if you look across the US, as part of the expansion.
And then you bought that imaging business. It turned out imaging was the wrong market to be in. So you sold that business.
We were a great exit strategy for a lot of owners that saw the demise coming. And we live and learn. So, but yes, and then grew it back to 2 billion on physician and also extended care.
Yep, makes sense. And then you were the CEO by the time you sold to McKesson.
That's right.
I'm curious if you could share more on like the thought process, like why did you decide to sell to McKesson at the time? And then a little bit about the time McKesson then afterward.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I will tell you, one of the hardest decisions to ever make. One, because look, I love what I was doing, and so that can sometimes cloud your vision as to what is coming. And so one of the reasons, that you're successful and the other people are successful is because they just keep fighting, right? Every time they get knocked down, they just keep fighting. And to use the boxer and the ring analogy, right? You just never stop fighting. Well, that's when you're the manager of the company. If you're also responsible to the investors, right?
Yep.
You have to look at it from both the fighter in the ring and sort of the coach that's outside the ring. And so when I really saw what I believed was coming, which was a hyper consolidation of physician office, what I really saw was, okay, that's not who we serve the best. There were other companies who served the very large hospital-owned practices better than we did. We were number one at the small, to medium-sized physician office, but they were going away. And the purchasing was no longer done by the physician or the nurse. It was done by a hospital procurement person. And I believe that was going to fundamentally shift the industry, and then also, the companies that served them. So then found it was the right time to become part of McKesson, who obviously is a very large company that had a business similar to ours. And that's how we ended up.
So really the driving factor was a change in your end market, the consolidation of your customers.
Absolutely. Seeing that it was structural, not cyclical.
So what were the signals that you were looking for to say, because I'm guessing there was consolidation for a long time prior to you guys actually selling the business. So what was sort of the signal or the tipping point that made you say, hey, this is like going fast enough now, or enough of it that we need to do something different?
Sure. And you're exactly right. The consolidation had to happen. We've been watching it, but there was still plenty of pie left, right? So when you're looking at it, we're a public company, that has to continue to grow, and when I saw that the rate of the pie shrinking, at least the pie of the small fragmented physician offices was shrinking faster than I believed we could take share. So we had really been good at taking share up, to that point, and we're still taking share. But when the total available customers is shrinking faster than you can take customers from competitors, you realize, and if that's not going to change, which it has not, by the way, then there's only, you can see where that's going.
I'm curious what it was like to go from, $2 billion public company to I don't know how big McKesson was at the time, but $100 billion revenue public company, maybe 200 billion. what that transition was like.
It was wild. I will say this. So the funny thing is, because people would say, it's so different for me. And I said, look, I went from CEO to COO, and it's only one letter, but it makes a big difference. So, so I went from, CEO of a public company to, a leader of a division of. And
Yep.
so, what I will say is the leaders at the time, John Hammergan and Paul Julian, were great, and I knew all the people that we could have been a part of, and they were definitely the right team to be a part of. They had med surge business. John Hammergan, the CEO's father, started out selling medical supplies, and so he had a respect for what was required in the business. And so it was the right place to be. Now I would say it's a big difference, because when you get to make all the decisions, and then you're part of a much larger company, just like with anything, if we were to do something, well, you may or may not be able to do that because another division doesn't do it that way. And if we allow you to do that, then we'd have to allow them to do that. Now, I'm not saying it's not the right decision for a $200 billion business, but yeah, that was very different. But I would say now just the capital that was available to then upgrade facilities need to be upgraded. The things that we need to do to compete was unmatched. So it was the right decision at the time, but you got to adapt, and as the people had to that when we bought them.
And then you escaped the world of distribution to go to the Wounded Warrior Project.
I did.
I'm just curious about that experience just briefly, and then I want to jump into some of the growth culture stuff.
Yeah. So, well, I'll tell you real quick. Sometimes people would say, "Hey, how come you went from for-profit to nonprofit?" And I said, "I didn't. I went from PSS to Wounded Warrior Project." And so I didn't always have this dream of being part of a nonprofit. But what I would say is at some point in your life, you start to see things maybe through a different lens, and got a little bit older and started realizing, that all these things that we were very proud of building. Look, we were very excited for what we built. The path to 2 billion was fun, and it was purposeful, and it was profitable. But at some point you look around and you start realizing that, everything we built was built on this foundation of safety and security that I largely had taken for granted. And you can see in the world today, a lot of people cannot take that for granted, that every day you wake up and you'll be in a safe place to build and then it's really up to you. And so at that point I realized, that you don't take it for granted, that lives were lost for it, and lives forever changed for it. And it was too late for me to enlist. So I found a way to serve those who had served, and then was there for 7 years, and it was absolutely humbling. And we talk about sacrifice and how much I traveled, all the work I did, very humbling to meet people that really, really sacrificed, and then will sacrifice the rest of their lives. Because of what they did to provide that foundation. So yeah, it was fantastic. The people I worked with were great, because they were military, didn't understand business to a degree, and I was business, didn't understand the military. So it was, we literally had to make like the vocab list. Like, what do you mean when you say, E&L, so it was a great experience, very humbling.
Awesome. Well, I want to jump in to talk about sort of the growth culture that you created at PSS, because I think it was pretty unique. I mean, 15 million in revenue, hiring someone who out of college to go sell, that was like a really core part of the culture. Can you talk a little bit about sort of like what that culture was like, and how you built the sales team?
Sure. And I would say, first of all, that, I was a part of it, but there were plenty of other people that were, I don't say that to be like overly humble. I mean, like Pat Kelly established that growth culture early on. And so I learned from him and then tried to expand from what we learned. But I think the biggest difference, Benj, is, and I'll get to how we did it, was the reason I think we grew faster than our competitors was relatively simple. At the foundation, we had owners competing with their employees, and so it wasn't a sales culture per se, it was a growth culture, which means everybody in the organization was responsible for growth. Everybody. And everybody had to understand why. So understand the mission, the purpose, why are we doing this? They had to understand how their role impacted the growth, good or bad, right? And they had to understand how their pay would be impacted up or down based on whether or not we grew or not. And so that type of alignment created, very passionate owners. And, we had people that, the delivery person that's delivering the product now doesn't just want to make sure the box gets from A to B, wants to make sure that customer is wowed so that they buy more the next time, because our people on paper made a little less than our competitors, but in their bank accounts, they all made 30, 40, 50% more.
This is going to sound crazy, but it's true. We've talked to distributors who will say, I pay commission, and I have some reps who they make as much money as they want to make, and so they don't really go and try to do more than that. Was there anything you guys looked for on the front end to find people that were hungry who wouldn't say something like that?
So yes, I think the first part is start there, right? In the hiring practice, are you looking for somebody that's really hungry, that's really driven, and if not, first of all, if you're hiring the wrong person, beginning, forget about it. You're going to be, pushing a string the whole rest of your life trying to manage and lead that person. Now, I will say at some point is sometimes even the hungriest people, will get to a certain point and say, I'm okay. I've made enough, I've covered. And now as a company, we still had to continue to grow. And so persuasive speeches plus comp plan that said, by the way, if we write the same business every year, none of us will make the same amount of money, right? Because one, cost will go up, delivery people's pay will go down, and therefore as a sales rep, pay goes down. So we just really wanted to make sure that our reps, when they were walking around, they had a strategic plan in one hand, and a P&L in the other, but they didn't know it. They just had a comp plan that they would maximize. And if they maximize that comp plan, it was good for the P&L, and it fit our strategy, if that makes sense.
You guys are pushing reps pretty hard. Sort of how do you balance like sort of burnout, or especially new reps, like younger reps who may not know the industry as well? Like how do you ramp them well without sort of burning them out on the back end?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so I start with the young reps. First of all, you have to make sure that we give them a little bit of time, right? So there was basically the draw, right? You start out, 100% salary, which was low, because if you were bought in, it was like taking stock options in the tech world in San Fran, right? You bought it low, but as that came down, your comp would increase. So be fair with people, but at the same time is if you've hired the right people and you give them the right tools and support them, right? Then they want to grow. They want to grow. So now, how do you push people without burning them out? What I would tell you is here's how I've seen poor leaders or new leaders screw up. And this is how you burn out a rep in a sales force is you constantly just remind them of the results that you need from them and pretend that's leadership, right? Like it'd really be like a head coach saying, hey, guess what, Benj? You ran 65 yards last game. Now I need you to run 75. And he walks out like, thanks for the wisdom.
Yeah, of course.
So but and sometimes pretend that that's leadership and it's not. So I always used to say, look, results are critical, but it's the last thing you talk about. It's hearts, minds, behavior, results. So you start with the heart, which is, again, the Simon Sinek's why, which is, look, we want to win the Super Bowl. And when you win the Super Bowl, it's going to be great. It's going to be good for your family. This is how we're going to celebrate and all right. And so then you go to minds though, because, okay, you bought in heart-wise to win the Super Bowl, but the mind is the strategy because you have to satisfy because, yeah, but do I believe it? You say, here's a strategy for winning this game and then winning our conference, right? And then winning the Super Bowl. People go, okay, I can actually see that happening. Then it's behavior. So, which is, this is what I need from you on a day-to-day basis. Okay? This is how early you be in the weight room. This is how I want you to watch film. These are all the things that need to do. And when you do that, you're going to run for 85 yards, right? Next game. And when you do that, that's going to help us to win. And so the problem is when people just wear people out with another goal, they're just expecting, oh, guess what? If I grow 10% next year, it's going to be 10% on top of that the year after. So if there's no purpose, there's no heart, mind, and behavior, and it's just all about the results, you'll wear people out even at the smallest levels of growth. Now, I will say, and some people just aren't meant for sales. Yeah. Not everybody's right for every role, right? You could have moved me out of a lot of roles into other roles. I would have failed spectacularly. So not everybody's right for it. You give people the chance to be right for it. And if they're not good at it, it's the worst low paying job and the best high paying job. So, at 100% comp, a commission, you figure it out pretty quick.
Most sales reps spend 72% of their week on admin tasks instead of actually selling. Proton changes that. We're a CRM built for distributors that guides your reps on who to call and what to sell. Our AI assistant Pronto even gives instant answers to questions like, what do I need to know about this account? Or which product should I pitch them next? Swish nearly tripled their growth rate by using Proton. You could too. Start by visiting proton.ai to learn more. Now back to the show.
On the hiring side, what are the top 3 things you guys would look for when you're hiring a salesperson, like qualities that you need?
So I would tell you, when we were hiring off the college campus, right, a lot of people would say that's very hard. And so what we looked for a lot of times were people that had demonstrated they were either very competitive athletes, but you wanted somebody that was driven as a young person. Because if you're not driven as a young person, it's a little hard to just immediately get driven. Right? So we look for driven behavior. A lot of times it was athletes, but if not, it was somebody that had paid their way through school. So I wanted somebody that was working, that's the position I was in. I had to work to pay for my own school, and so you're looking for somebody that was serious, that was, that was driven, that was hardworking. And if they'd experienced that, if they had exhibited that prior, that was a good start, to hire. And not every hire worked out, but sometimes they worked out in a different role inside the company.
So you guys experienced a very long period of strong organic growth. I'm guessing it wasn't all just up and to the right. So in the moments when sort of growth started to slow down, how did you tell a story about how you diagnosed the problem and sort of where you started when you were trying to figure out how to get the organic engine going?
Yeah. I'm glad you used the word, because one of the lessons that it took me a while to learn was a lot of times we jump to conclusions because if you're an action-oriented person, you're probably going to skip this step because you want to take action. And so what we would skip is the accurate diagnosis because we already wanted to write the prescription, right? And then, right, and if you've misdiagnosed it, you just keep writing new scripts. You just keep throwing new stuff at it. And so if we had a stall period where it slowed down, of course we had those. The first thing I would look at was, has something changed in the market? If you just go to sales and say, either everybody just got lazy or everybody doesn't care anymore or whatever, look, it's possible. But it was pull yourself back up and say, has something changed with the competitors? Has something changed with the customers? Is utilization different, right? And if all of that was the same, then I'd start to look for, what are the distractions? Are we distracting the reps with something? Have we increased admin in some way? Have we changed policies that made it harder to bring on new customers? Are we focusing on the right products that will actually drive that goal? Because sometimes you could be focusing on products that you get a lot of sales units, but you don't get a lot of dollars. So I would check and say, make sure we were focused on the right things.
I want to go back to the sort of hiring of younger reps. And you mentioned that not many companies go and recruit reps right out of college. And that was a key part of the strategy. So what are people missing when they are focused only on hiring industry veteran reps versus new reps?
Well, look, I will speak to our experience, and I know what worked for us. I'm not saying it's the only way that works. Okay. And certainly we had pro reps come on, but we were acquiring companies. But what we found was, if you're trying to do things differently, you need people that are willing to think differently. And it was easy to start with somebody that didn't have any preconceived notions. When we first started, we changed the service expectation of the customer. We did things very differently. We did same day service. We did, lowest unit measure. We did, guarantees. There were lots of things that we did that if you had been around a while, you'd say, and so very coachable, very mobile. If we needed a rep to say, by the way, because they said, I moved to Jackson, Mississippi, I moved to Miami, I moved to Albuquerque, I moved to El Paso, I moved to Birmingham. And so coachable, mobile, cheap. So I was cheap. They got me cheap early on because I didn't have any money, and I believed in the cause. And I would also say sometimes I think we get a little lazy. When we hire and just say, I'm going to go hire this industry veteran. Well, you're assuming that their experience was good experience. And I would tell you what we found is a lot of sales training is horrendous if provided at all. So it was easier to start fresh with a blank slate in some cases than try and get people to undo some bad behaviors, that they already had.
Yeah.
So I would say coachable and mobile and, blank slates and hungry, all those things.
I want to talk a little bit about accountability. Oftentimes, leaders of distribution sales teams are sort of afraid of the sales reps and are afraid to hold the team really accountable because reps will leave. They won't be happy. They don't want to push too hard. These guys are our best reps, whatever. How did you think about accountability in your organization?
I would say two things on that. One, I would say is, I was a very young rep, and a young leader. And so a lot of my, reps were older than I was, in some cases twice as old as I was. And I learned very quickly what reps were really good at was setting precedent for how this relationship was going to go, right? So I was technically the sales leader, but they would quickly send you on a list of tasks and make you a support person for them. Which means you can't lead, you can't expect because you're too busy running around trying to support the sales team. Now that sales team needs support, but not from the leader if you're technically a leader. So I would say there are certainly some leaders that are not leading. And if they're not leading, then you can decide whether they should work there or not. So some, you may not have the constitution, let's say, to actually have those tough conversations with those reps. Again, start with, here's the why, here's the Super Bowl, right? Here's the how, here's the strategy, here's the behavior I need and the results I need. And if you don't do it, you're going to hurt the whole team. Now expect that result. And if they don't do it, right, you have to be willing to take the next step, right? And if you won't, then you have no credibility whatsoever. Now, what I will also say is I've also seen where somebody will say that this person won't hold somebody accountable. But what that really means was they won't do what they want you to do. Think of a traditional CRM company, right? That says, hey, by the way, you need to hold your reps accountable and make them do, what we think they should do. And what I would say is if that sales rep is the tip of the spear and a critical point for success of the CRM inside the company, well, then they're the first customer. And if you believe they're the first customer, who says, how do we hold that customer accountable to use us, right? What you do is you build something that they
want to
really want to use, right? That they'd scream if you took them away. And if you don't believe the sales rep is the first customer and they're critical for your success, well, good luck to you. Because, so I believe leaders can be weak in the moment and not hold somebody accountable. And sometimes that's not the root of the problem.
That's not the root of the problem. Yeah, it's a good pivot point. I'm curious, in your view, like, why is it that salespeople resist sort of traditional CRM?
So I don't want to throw all CRMs in the same one, but let's just say for most of history, okay? I would say because a lot of times those CRMs were built by well-meaning people, but let's just say well-meaning engineers who make the classic engineer mistake, and that's optimizing for something that shouldn't exist. So making a sales rep efficient at something they should not even be doing, right? And so what you're really doing is making them into a more efficient customer service person. And so they resist it because the rep can smell right away, which is, if the rep felt like a customer and said, this makes my life better and I can sell twice as much, you don't have to hold them accountable to do it, right? So I think people have just misunderstood who the first customer is. They keep saying over and over, which is like, if the sales rep adoption rate would just be greater, and like, well, if you treat them like a customer, right, and gave them a tool that cut their admin in half and doubled their sales, I assure you won't be talking about holding them accountable anymore.
Outside of just CRM, there are many ways that sales reps end up really being customer service people. I mean, we've heard stories about customers who we heard someone who told us that their reps, this is a Jansan distributor, their reps will go and actually just like refill the paper towel dispensers on site for their customers. And it's like, that's amazing. But this is a rep that makes like $300,000 a year who's like going in and putting in paper towel. So how did you avoid that?
Look, it's a great question. I would have to say is I won't necessarily say whether filling that paper dispenser was wrong or right until I see the results. If somehow that rep has figured out and said, you know what, I can't leave, Benj because I don't know how to refill my paper dispenser, then you go, that probably wasn't such a bad idea, right? But I think in some cases, selling is hard and service is easier, and I don't mean to downplay what it takes to serve, right? But you just go to the easier thing and you go, well, I'm great at serving the customer. Well, guess what? That's part of the role, so it's really, if I never really care if a rep's figured out how to do it and they were growing, right? Some of them were very focused on those special things and others weren't. But it can't be to the exclusion of sales. If you're doing those sort of special fill the paper towel thing, great. As long as you're growing and that's part of your growth strategy. If it's instead of focusing on actually professional selling, then AI will probably not be good for you.
You became CEO of a business that when you joined was founder led. What was that transition like?
So just to be clear, I was the third CEO. So over the 30 years, I was the third. So it was our founder, and then it was our CFO, and then it was me.
And then it was you.
So I learned so much from our founder. I tried to take everything I learned, and then apply it in a new environment, right? So much of our founders' tenure was while we were private, So then when we became public, it's a very different role, So I had to watch from the two people prior to me. One who was the founder, incredible person that built this private company up into $1 billion plus. We went public, and then I learned from the CFO who became the CEO because he was more astute at being a public company CEO. And then really trying to, learn from the both of them who were very impressive. So, it's a different animal, right? Because you spend a lot of your time as a public company, on the investor side. Then you have to make sure that you've really built up the team, your team, to run the day to day. So, it's a great challenge, but it's a fun one.
One thing that we value at Proton is curiosity. So after a long career in distribution, what's one thing you still don't have a good answer for or still trying to figure out or learn?
There's one I struggle with because I've seen CEOs succeed and fail spectacularly in this way, which is when do you listen to others and when do you go with your gut? So I will tell you that I've seen CEOs that the reason they were so successful for so many years is because they would listen, but eventually, no matter what anybody said, they went with their gut. And guess what? They were right and others were wrong. When Pat Kelly started PSS, right, everybody said, are you kidding me? But right, and guess what? He was right and they were wrong. And he learned, to not listen when his gut said, right, that works until it doesn't, And so at some point we all learn, like, we should have listened to somebody else. And what I haven't been able to figure out is what's the formula? What's the recipe? What's the criteria? What's the guideline that would say, this is a time I should probably be listening to somebody else and not go there? Because part of your success is built off of your gut instincts. And part of it is because you're listening to others. So when is the right one? I'm still struggling with how I would give advice on that.
Awesome. Gary, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really glad to have you.
Yeah, look, it was a real pleasure.
That's it for this episode of In the Mind of a Distributor. If you like this conversation, leave a review. It helps more folks in distribution find the show. If you're thinking about a CRM for your business, head to proton.ai to see how Proton can help you grow faster. Or if you want to connect with me, you can add me, Benj Cohen, on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.